And then the next thing we saw was 3 people in the water coming down the river.
Aerial footage shows the fallen bridge over the M20 London-bound carriageway.
Britain has been building bridges for almost 2,000 years. In that time, engineers here have solved problems that seemed impossible: wide estuaries, deep gorges, storm-battered coastlines. But not every bridge Britain has built has stayed standing. Some collapsed under weather nobody accounted for. Some failed because of a material engineers hadn't fully understood yet. And some came down for reasons so strange, so specific, that you'd struggle to believe them if they weren't extensively documented in newspapers at the time. These are 12 of the worst bridge disasters in British history, and in each one, the reason it happened tells you something real about how bridge engineering actually evolved. 12. The Menai Suspension Bridge Storm Damage, 1839. Thomas Telford's Menai Suspension Bridge, completed in 1826, was one of the great engineering marvels of its age, the longest suspension bridge in the world at the time it opened, connecting the island of Anglesey to mainland Wales. But in January 1839, a severe storm exposed a problem nobody had fully anticipated. The timber deck, hung from Telford's iron chains, wasn't rigid enough to resist the wind, and violent gusts caused sections of it to swing and buckle badly enough to cause serious damage. No design at that scale had ever been tested against wind like this before. The bridge survived, but the damage forced years of reinforcement work, and it became one of the earliest hard lessons in a problem that would haunt British suspension bridge engineering for the rest of the century. Wind doesn't just push against a bridge, it can make the whole structure move in ways rigid calculations never accounted for. 11. The Bull Bridge Accident, 1860. On the 26th of September, 1860, at Bull Bridge near Ambergate in Derbyshire, a cast-iron railway bridge failed as a goods train passed over it. Like so many cast-iron failures of this era, the bridge gave no warning before it broke. It's a smaller, less well-remembered disaster than some of the others on this list, but it's part of the same grim pattern: cast-iron bridges across the country quietly failing, one after another, decades before the profession fully accepted that the material simply couldn't be trusted for this kind of repeated moving load. 10. The Cleddau Bridge Collapse, 1970. On the 2nd of June, 1970, in the small Pembrokeshire village of Pembroke Ferry, a section of the part-built Cleddau Bridge, a 150-ton slab of steel and concrete being cantilevered out toward the next support pillar, suddenly gave way. Witnesses described a loud groan, then a deafening crash, then a cloud of red dust rolling through the village. 4 workers were killed, 5 more injured, and the wreckage came down just yards from a row of occupied houses. One resident's home sat close enough that the collapsed section landed at a 45-degree angle in her garden. What made this one especially significant wasn't just the loss of life. Investigators found the entire design approach, a specific type of steel box girder construction, was fundamentally flawed. That finding didn't just affect Cleddau. It triggered a nationwide review of every box girder bridge under construction in Britain at the time, and permanently changed how that entire class of bridge gets engineered and inspected to this day. 9. The Loddon Viaduct Collapse, 1972. 2 years after Cleddau, in Woodley, near Reading, a section of the A329 dual carriageway viaduct crossing the River Loddon collapsed. Coming so soon after Cleddau's box girder failure, this incident added directly to the growing national concern that Britain's newer generation of pre-stressed and box girder structures hadn't been tested thoroughly enough before construction. Between these 2 failures alone, British engineering standards for this exact type of bridge were rewritten within just a few years. A rare case of 2 disasters in close succession, actually forcing an entire industry to slow down and rethink its own methods. 8. The Severn Railway Bridge Collision, 1960. Not every bridge disaster on this list involves a design flaw. Some are simply the result of terrible luck. On the night of the 25th of October 1960, thick fog settled over the Severn estuary. 2 oil barges, drifting with the tide in near-zero visibility, collided directly with 2 piers of the Severn Railway Bridge. The impact caused a partial collapse, and the wreckage ignited, setting the structure ablaze. 5 crewmen aboard the barges were killed. The damage was severe enough that repairing the bridge was never considered economically viable, and rather than rebuild it, the remaining structure was simply demolished over the following years. It's a stark reminder that a bridge doesn't need a single structural flaw to fail. Sometimes the disaster comes from underneath, from the water it was built to cross. 7. The Inverythan rail accident, 1882. In rural Aberdeenshire, Scotland, a cast-iron railway bridge failed under the weight of a passing train. Cast iron, brittle and prone to sudden catastrophic fracture rather than gradual bending, had been a popular Victorian building material precisely because it was cheap and easy to cast into complex shapes. Inverythan became one of several 19th century collapses that slowly built the case against it. Each individual failure looked, on its own, like an isolated accident. Together, they told a much bigger story. 6. The Norwood Junction rail accident, 1891. 9 years after Inverythan in South London, another cast-iron bridge gave way, again under a passing train. By this point, the pattern was becoming impossible for the engineering profession to ignore. Cast iron behaves nothing like wrought iron or steel under sudden, repeated stress. It doesn't flex and warn you before it breaks. It simply snaps. Norwood Junction, coming after Inverythan, and further back after Dee and Tay, helped push British railway engineering firmly and permanently away from cast iron as a load-bearing material for new bridge construction. 5. The Baddengorm burn collapse, Carrbridge, 1914. On the 18th of June, 1914, a passenger train departed Carrbridge in the Scottish Highlands heading toward Inverness. Minutes later, it reached a masonry bridge crossing the Baddengorm Burn, a small mountain stream. Except that morning, the stream wasn't small at all. A sudden, violent cloudburst on the mountainside above had sent a wall of floodwater surging down, undermining the bridge's foundations just before the train arrived. The bridge gave way beneath the weight of the crossing train, and the last 5 carriages plunged into the gorge below. 5 passengers died. It's a genuinely eerie preview of a disaster that would repeat itself in almost identical form more than 70 years later. 4. The Glanrhyd Bridge collapse, 1987. Just days after the Great Storm of 1987, one of the most destructive storms in modern British history had already battered the country. A train operator on the Heart of Wales line reported flooding along the tracks near Llandrindod Wells. On the morning of the 19th of October, the responsible traffic manager decided to personally accompany the first train of the day out on the line, the 5:27 service from Swansea to Shrewsbury, to assess conditions himself. As the train crossed Glanrhyd Bridge near Llandilo, Carmarthenshire, moving at just 10 miles an hour, the normal speed limit for that crossing, the swollen River Towy had already partially washed the bridge away beneath it. The train fell into the river. Of the 10 people aboard, 6 managed to escape. The driver and 3 passengers drowned. It's the almost exact same mechanism as Carrbridge in 1914, floodwater silently undermining a bridge's foundations until the structure simply can't support the next train that crosses it, separated by more than 70 years and yet nearly identical in how it unfolded. 3. The Dee Bridge disaster, 1847. On the 24th of May, 1847, in Chester, a cast-iron railway bridge over the River Dee collapsed as a passenger train crossed it, killing 5 people. This wasn't just another cast-iron failure, it became one of the most influential bridge disasters in the entire history of British engineering. The bridge had been designed by Robert Stephenson, one of the most respected railway engineers of the Victorian era, which made the failure genuinely shocking to the profession. The subsequent inquiry exposed serious problems with how cast-iron girders behaved under the combined weight and vibration of a moving train, findings that went on to directly shape how bridges were designed across the entire country for decades afterward. If you want a single moment where British engineering collectively realised cast iron alone couldn't be trusted for major railway spans, this is it. 2. The Tay Bridge disaster, 1879. On the night of the 28th of December 1879, a violent storm tore across the Firth of Tay in Scotland. As a passenger train crossed the Tay Rail Bridge connecting Wormit to Dundee, the central navigation spans of the bridge collapsed, taking the train, 6 carriages, and everyone aboard straight down into the water below. Somewhere between 59 and 75 people died. There were no survivors. The bridge's designer, Sir Thomas Booch, had calculated the structure's wind loading at just £10 per square foot. Remarkably, on an earlier proposal for a different bridge across the Forth, he had used a figure 3 times higher. The inquiry found that catastrophic underestimation of wind pressure to be the central cause of the collapse. Bouch's reputation was destroyed. He died less than a year later. Every future British bridge design was required to account for wind loadings of at least £56 per square foot, more than 5 times what Bouch had used at Tay, and his own design for the Forth Bridge was scrapped entirely. To this day, it remains the 5th deadliest railway accident in the entire history of the United Kingdom. 1. The Yarmouth Suspension Bridge Disaster, 1845. And yet, for pure disbelief-inducing tragedy, nothing on this list compares to what happened in Great Yarmouth on the 2nd of May, 1845. Cook's Royal Circus, a well-known travelling show, had promised the town something genuinely bizarre. A clown named Arthur Nelson would sail up the River Bure in a washtub, pulled by 4 geese. It sounds absurd, and it was, but it worked exactly as intended. Thousands of spectators gathered along the riverbanks and packed onto the suspension bridge itself for a better view. An estimated 300 to 400 people crowded onto a structure never designed for that kind of concentrated weight. As Nelson passed beneath the bridge and the crowd surged toward one side to watch, a connecting rod cracked. Witnesses heard the noise. Some laughed it off and stayed exactly where they were. Then, 5 to 10 minutes later, the chains along one side gave way entirely, and the deck tipped violently into the river below, throwing hundreds of people into the water. Rescuers rushed in by boat, pulling survivors and bodies alike from the river, while the injured were carried into nearby houses and pubs as an urgent call went out for every available doctor in town. 79 people died. Many of them were children, crushed against the parapet railing by the weight of the crowd pressing in behind them as the bridge went down. It remains, to this day, the deadliest bridge disaster in British history, caused not by a storm, not by a flaw in the steel, not by a flood, but by a crowd of ordinary people drawn together by the promise of watching a clown float past in a bathtub. 12 disasters, spanning almost a century and a half, and yet a handful of patterns run through nearly all of them. Cast iron kept failing until engineers finally stopped trusting it. Floodwater kept undermining foundations decades apart, at Carrbridge and again at Glanrhyd, in almost the exact same way. And storms, whether wrecking a timber deck at Menai in 1839, tearing down Tay in 1879, or waiting in the fog at Severn in 1960, kept proving that Britain's weather has never fully respected the calculations engineers made on paper. Every single one of these disasters changed something: a material, a design standard, a wind load calculation that's still shaping how bridges get built in this country today. The bridges themselves are mostly gone now, replaced, rebuilt, or simply removed. What they left behind is the reason the bridge you're driving over right now is built the way it is.